subscribe now and press the bell icon. Never miss an update.
Hello. This question paper was set for the candidates who appeared in term and examination December 2021. Now your first question is about reference to the context. Look at the first stanza. Wilt thou forgive that sin where I began, which was my sin, though it were done before? Wilt thou forgive that sin through which I ran? These are the first three lines taken from the poem A Hymn to God the Father, written by John Donne. It is a metaphysical poem in which the poet asks forgiveness for the sinners he was born with and for the sinners he himself committed. In these lines, the poet asks God if he would forgive him for the sin he was born with, though the sin was committed long before by Adam and Eve by disobeying God in heaven. The poet also feels sorry for his own sins which he committed in his life and asks for forgiveness for those sins also. Now, look at the second part. Hence when deluding joys, the brood are fully without further bread, how little you bested, or fill the fixed mind with all your toys. Again we see the opening lines taken from the poem Il Penseroso, written by John Milton in 1631. In the poem, the poet celebrates melancholy. The poet in the poem seems to be in pensive mood and emphasis on a solitary, scholarly life. In these opening lines, the poet rejects joys and calls them useless and false belief. The poet directly mentions them as brood of folly, means the offspring of fools which does not seem to have proper lineage. It has only assisted a man by infusing fancies in his mind. Now look at the third part. When my mother died, I was very young, and my father sold me, while yet my tongue could scarcely cry, weep, 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 so your chimneys I sweep, and in sooth I sleep. Continuously we see opening lines taken from the poem The Chimney Sweeper, written by William Blake and was published in his 1789 collection Songs of Innocence. The poem is narrated by a young boy, a chimney sweeper who has been sold into labor by his father. The poem is against the child labor which was prominent in 18th and 19th century England. Now in these lines, the speaker tells us that he was just a little boy when his mother died. His father then forced him to start working as a chimney sweeper at the time when he even did not know how to speak. Since then, he is sweeping chimneys and sleep covered with soot. Now look at the last part of this question. There's a panther stalks me down. One day I will have my death of him. His greed has set the woods aflame. He prowls more lordly than the sun. Again we see opening lines taken from the poem Pursuit, written by Sylvia Plath. The poem was written after she met Ted Hughes. The poetess presents the image of herself as being the prey of the wild panther. The panther shows male domination in the society. Now in these lines, the poetess is being chased by a panther, and the speaker is sure that she will fall prey to him one day. His greed has burnt her world and prowls everywhere like the rays of the sun reach everywhere. Now let us look at question number 2. Attempt an analysis of the portraits of the prioress, the monk, the friar, and the wife of Bath. The prioress is named as Madame Eglinton. She is a well-bred woman who speaks French with English accent. She is of mild disposition and is compassionate towards animals. She is wearing a set of prayer beads on which hangs a brooch. The monk has been described as wealthy and luxurious who takes pleasure in hunting. Usually monks were supposed to follow the principles of obedience, poverty, and celibacy. Their activities include praying and glorifying God, giving alms to the poor, and copying manuscripts. But Joshua's monk dismisses the Augustinian idea of asceticism and renunciation of the world and cloister learning. The life of monks suggests an ideological change. The friars were the members of religious order. They were bound to take the vow of living a life of poverty. Their duty was to preach the teaching of Christ. They reached out to the mass, teaching the Bible, begging for money, and enriched their wealth. Chaucer's friar Herbert is an example of corruption of the church which were attacked by Wycliffe and his followers. The wife of Bath has been described as slightly deaf and seamstress by profession. She is neatly dressed and has put on a broad hat. Being a well-experienced pilgrim, she gives advices to other pilgrims. Let us now look at question number 3. Can MEG-1 be called a comic fantasy? Comment. Comic fantasy is sometimes also referred to as fantasy comedy. It is a blend of fantasy and comedy where the main purpose is to amuse the reader and the tune is humorous. Now, talking about the poem MEG-1 is a satire or a mock heroic poem written by John Dryden and published in 1682. The poem is an attack on Thomas Shadwell, who according to Dryden was dull at poetry. Their cause of enmity was not only literary backgrounds, but also political ones. MEG-1 in the poem is Richard Flecknoe, whom the poet calls the reigning king of dull poetry. Flecknoe is now about to resign and wants Shadwell to succeed him. Flecknoe in his speech humorously relates that he has always waged war against wit, but Shadwell's terrible poetry easily surpasses his poetry. In the end, Shadwell becomes the new king of dull poetry. Now you might have understood that the poem amused the readers humorously, so it fits in the genre of comic fantasy as well. Look at question number 4. Discuss the Prelude as an autobiographical poem. The Prelude is the only record of Wordsworth's inner life. The poem is not a self-portrait, but a record of a poet's mental and spiritual growth from his childhood. The poem is concerned with the development of the poet's artistic sensibilities. In the poem, he only mentions those actions and experiences which are of utmost importance for the evolution of his soul. In the poem, he tries to capture his nature-inspired life that he lived through his childhood and youth and concentrates on the role of nature in shaping and stimulating his growing imagination. It's a poem about the growth of a poet's mind. Look at question number 5. What do you think is Yeats's contribution to modern poetry? Yeats may be credited primarily with the honor of contributing the elements of mysticism to modern poetry. Yeats also includes pessimism in his poems. He introduced magical symbols in his poetry. Yeats also applies the theory of the mask to his poetry, hence producing complex but still relatable work. Yeats is one of the writers that utilized the elements of the supernatural stemming from Irish mythology. He used theatrical metaphors in his poetry. Look at question number 6. Attempt an analysis of Eliot's poetic vision in the Wasteland. Eliot's The Wasteland is an important work in the history of English poetry. Being a realist, Eliot talks about the living conditions, problems, and perplexities of people belonging to different sections of society in the modern world. The Wasteland is a long poem divided in 5 parts under the title The Burial of the Dead, Game of Chess, The Fire Sermon, Death by Water, What the Thunder Said. The first part is about the modern man who has lost his faith in moral and spiritual values. Modern man is indulged in sex, gambling, and violence. The poem talks about the worsening conditions of man and civilization. In the second part, the poet talks about the failure of sex relationship in the modern world. Sex has become an entertainment for the modern man and has lost its moral and social purpose. The sex perversion has made modern life completely unproductive and desolate. In the third section, The Fire Sermon, the poet tells that lust and rape have destroyed modern society and this degeneration is common in all classes of modern society. The poet also prays to God to save the modern civilization from lust and spiritual degeneration. In the fourth part, the poet has suggested the significance of water as a means of purification and rebirth. Eliot describes a man, Phlebas, the Phoenician, who has died apparently by drowning. In death he has forgotten his worldly cares as the creatures of the sea have picked his body apart. The narrator asks his reader to consider flavors and recall his or her own mortality. In the final section, Eliot suggests that there is a need of effort for the realization of the spiritual goal. According to Eliot, it is impossible to reform the whole world and wonders where the change should begin from. Then he says that he must start with himself. The theme of the poem is the spiritual and emotional sterility of the modern world. Man has lost his passion, his faith in God and religion. His passion to participate in religion and his decay of faith has resulted in the loss of vitality, both spiritual and emotional. Let's now look at question number 7. Bring out the Imagist elements in Eliot and Pound. Imagism was a reactionary movement against Romanticism and Victorian poetry. Imagism emphasizes simplicity, clarity of expression, and precision through the use of exacting visual images. The principles of Imagist poetry are direct treatment of the thing, whether subjective or objective, to use absolutely no word that does not contribute to the presentation. As regarding rhythm, to compose in the sequence of the musical phrase, not in the sequence of a metronome. An example from Ezra Pound's In a Station of the Metro. The apportion of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bow. Pound uses free verse and a plain image to express a complex theme. These people are all separate, but all united as part of a whole as well. Each face is its own story, and the bow itself another. Eliot, who regularly used Imagist techniques such as a concise composition, parataxis, and musical rhythms to make his poetry, especially the Wasteland. April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs. This line has been taken from The Burial of the Dead, line first. The corpse planted in the garden, the burial of the dead. The river tent is broken, the fire sermon line. Look at question number 8. Attempt a critical appreciation of any one poem. You have I Remember, Poem in October, An Epistle to Dr. Arbuthnot. Then you have The Ballad of Reading Jail. So let's look at the first poem. I Remember. The poem was written by Thomas Hood and was published in 1844. The poem has 4 stanzas and each stanza consists of 8 lines. The poem follows the rhyme scheme of A, B, C, B, D, E, F, E. The poem is about the changing nature of time. The poet recalls his childhood memories and compares his childhood joy with his gloomy present. Next you have Poem in October. The poem is written by Durham Thomas. The poem was written in 1944 and published in the volume of poems Death and Entrance in 1946. It is a 7-stanza poem divided into 10-line sets. The poem does not follow any rhyme scheme and is thus written in free verse. The poem describes the speaker's trek out of autumn and up a hill to recapture childhood delight, the summer season, and his spirituality. Next is An Epistle to Dr. Arbuthnot. The poem is written by Alexander Pope and was published in January 1735. It is a long poem of 419 lines and is addressed to Pope's friend John Arbuthnot. The epistle is an apology in which Pope defends his works against the attacks of his detractors. The last one is The Ballad of Reading Jail. The poem is written by Oscar Wilde and was published in 1898. It is a 109-stanza poem separated into 6 sections. All the stanzas have the same rhyme scheme of A, B, C, B, D, B. The poem is a plea for the reformation of prison conditions. It gives the account of the emotional experience of imprisonment, something that Wilde lived firsthand when he was sentenced to 2 years hard labor in Reading Jail after a failed court case with his long-term partner's father.